Well, it is beginning to look a lot like Christmas. In no small measure because of the greenery that is scattered around the sanctuary and in other places outside and in. I think I've shared with you before, one of my most favorite images of Christmas is watching a car come down the street with a tree strapped to the roof, or a tree sticking out of the trunk. Personally, a couple years ago, I shared with you the saga of the Horak Christmas tree, a picture of which is here. And that's sort of my contribution to the family traditions. Kathleen does just about everything else, but the tree is, well, folks just leave the house when they know that I'm putting up the tree. The Christmas tree, or to be politically correct these days, the holiday tree, is the most recognized symbol of the Christian of Christmas today. But the universal acceptance of the tree is not quite that old. In fact, it's only been around for about 150 years, so it's a relatively new kid on the block. For many believers, for many Christians, they see within the Christmas tree the symbols of the spiritual essence of what Christmas is all about. But it was quite a different spirit that brought the trees into the house about 1,000 years ago. The roots for our modern-day Christmas tree can be traced to Scandinavia, and specifically the superstitious Vikings. They marveled at the evergreen's ability to survive winter's death. And they found hope and strength in evergreens. In fact, they began to suggest that evergreens had these special magical powers that could change and protect people from all kinds of evils. And so in Northern Europe, it's no surprise that pagan tree worship was very common in the area. In France, these trees were brought in to protect the home, and they were hung upside down from the rafters. Historians aren't really exactly sure why they did that, other than perhaps maybe just the practicality that in a very small cabin or cottage with limited floor space, by hanging it from the rafters, it would not take up space for traffic flow. And also the idea of hanging it upside down would probably prolong it from drying out so quickly. This charm-like interpretation of evergreens followed all the way to the custom of putting garland over a doorway to keep the evil spirits out, or placing wreaths in windows for the same purpose of keeping out those evil spirits. There is no association at all, at least in historical records, of the bringing in of the fir tree and Christmas until around 1510, and that was in Germany. You've probably all heard the story. Martin Luther, the great reformer, is thought to be the sort of the father of the modern Christmas tree. The story goes that he was walking late one evening through the forest, and he was very impressed by the starlight that was shining through the branches of these fir trees. And he tried to duplicate that at home, bringing a small fir tree into the house and attaching candles to it. It caught on in sort of a regional sense as a Christian celebration, but never really very expansive to the rest of the world. Certainly there were all kinds of interpretations of the evergreen. The green color itself was symbolic of everlasting life and of hope. And the addition of the candlelight, remembering he who is the light of the world, and the idea of hope and love as well. Symbols of both Christmas and of the Christian faith. All these years later, the Christmas tree is alive and well. 40 million Christmas trees will be purchased, it is forecast for this year. 30 million of those will be live trees. And I'm assuming they count not just those that are cut, but those that are bagged or balled as well. For every tree that is harvested, 3 additional trees are planted with the hopes that at least one of those will survive to the approximate size for a suitable tree taking approximately 10 to 15 years for those trees to become of any size. And the popularity is still with the fir tree, whether it be a Fraser, a Douglas, or a balsam. As with many other things, the Christmas tree is not without controversy, especially when it's confused as a Christian symbol. It is one of the few Christmas symbols that represents both the sacred and the secular views of Christmas. I always marvel about this particular custom and how strange it really is. And I would think that if we had some alien visitors who arrived here in December and watched us go about our business, watching folks travel to a lot or to a farm, or perhaps up in the attic, and drag a tree down into the house, moving furniture to clear sort of a featured spot, the hours of blood, sweat, and tears, stringing lights and adding decor, and all of that effort just for a few weeks of an indoor display. Trees have always fascinated people. They have appeared in images, in poems, and stories from the earliest days of human civilization. I think that we are just so inundated with all kinds of things that we miss the wonder and the awe of something as simple as a majestic tree. We tend to take so much for granted, including other wonders of nature. But even from the biblical text, we hear praises about a variety of kinds of trees. We hear about the strength and the beauty of the cedars of Lebanon, or the trees of sustenance, which would be like the fig tree or the olive tree, are central to the Middle Eastern concepts of wealth and security. And then this shoot that grows out of a stump, a seemingly dead tree, that suddenly a new shoot begins to have a resurrected hope that that tree will live again. But more than this, trees have stood as symbols of something larger and certainly more enduring than the brevity of human life. In fact, the typical tree can easily watch at least, if not more, 3 generations of humans live and die. And folks have identified one, it's called a bristlecone pine in California. They have established that it is probably 4,600 years old. When that little pine tree was a sapling, the pharaohs were ruling Egypt. Little wonder that trees evoke such a sense of awe, at least in some of us. The Hebrews themselves envisioned the growth of the human family as something like a tree-like process. And they believed that certain families, or sometimes even entire nations, were appointed and blessed by God to be trees of life. And these trees of life provided shelter as well as life-sustaining nourishment for all, for creatures, for human beings, great and small, dwelling in and under their protective branches, literally, if not figuratively. And several chapters earlier in the book of Isaiah, there's an image which is subtitled in your pew Bibles as the Song of the Vineyard in chapter 5, which really identifies making Israel herself a divinely ordered tree of life, is how they viewed it. The Old Testament's Daniel paints a beautiful, touching picture of this possibility when he writes these words of God for us. There was a tree at the center of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew great and strong. Its top reached to heaven, and it was visible to the ends of the whole earth. Its foliage was beautiful, its fruit abundant, and it provided food for all. The animals of the field found shade under it. The birds of the air nested in its branches, and from it all living things were fed. Christmas is a holiday well suited to trees. As I mentioned earlier, this idea of green boughs that served as devil-proof shields against all forces of evil. Because the evergreens refuse to die. They refuse to give up their green for winter. And even, it took a while, but even the church incorporated this idea of trees in celebration. There are several that we still see used today. There's something called a Jesse tree, which is typically adorned with symbols of Jesus' ancestors and is displayed for enhancing worship. The Chrismon tree, which we set up in a fairly prominent place in the Great Hall as you come in. Chrismon is simply combining of the word Christ and monogram, Christ monograms, Chrismon, and obviously it's decorated with very specific colors, in fact, of monograms of Jesus Christ through, as he's referred to by name through the New Testament, and certainly inferred as the coming Messiah in the Old Testament. There's another tree, though, that we don't really do a whole lot with these days. It's called the paradise tree. We've sort of lost this medieval custom of celebrating Adam and Eve Day, which was celebrated on December 24th. We've kept some of the character, though, of this particular tree in our rituals, which is sort of now, as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story. In the Baltic states of Eastern Europe, it was common for folks to play act or reenact the story of Adam and Eve and the fall of humankind from the Garden of Eden. Before the pageant was actually held, the actors would run through the streets and sort of encourage people to join them in the town square for this reenactment. And the character who was playing Adam in the story would carry a small fir tree. And attached to it were apples. Obviously, for telling the story of Adam and Eve, some kind of apple tree is significant. And so this tree was referred to as the tree of life, or again, the paradise tree. If you think about it as an early Christ tree, it was the first one that was decorated with apples, and apples are still common decorations today in certain parts of the country. To look at this Adam and Eve celebration, I think, is significant for us because it sort of reinforces this idea that we forget sometimes that there were two Adams. The first Adam, who blew it in the garden, but the promise of another Adam, a second Adam that would come, that would set things right. And so from apparently this dead, withered stump of Jesse is foretold this shooting forth of this green, this new growth, something completely new, a completely new being, referred to as the second Adam, also known as the Messiah, or Jesus the Christ, the Anointed One. Jesus' birth, if you think about it, was really the first real Christmas tree, or Christ tree. This true life, the tree of life, being made incarnate in the flesh in our world. And because Christmas is celebrated in the midwinter, and we'd love to think that that was something strategic with the calendars, but it was not at all. It just was sort of thought as a strategy to win over the pagan Northern Europeans and to Christianize them, because they were used to having a big party around the winter solstice. And specifically, that is why the Adam and Eve Day was chosen of December 24th, near the solstice. Unfortunately, we sometimes take the trappings of what was to remind us symbolically of a spiritual truth, and we get so hung up and caught up in that symbol that we miss the reality of the truth that it was intended to remind us of. Jesus Christ incarnated the tree of life, this tree that the Adam and Eve partook of and brought them death. Jesus turns that tree of life into a true eternal tree of life. That through Jesus Christ, or the second Adam, death itself will die, we're told, creating not only an evergreen, but an eternal green. The first 39 books of chapters of the book of Isaiah are commonly referred to as First Isaiah, primarily because they have one central focus or theme that seems to run throughout those early chapters, and that is the subject of judgment. But this morning's text, which comes in this 11th chapter, reveals that there's far more to First Isaiah than this cry for judgment and punishment. In fact, it presents the picture of of God's promise of an ever and eternal salvation. A much happier ending in this second story with the second Adam than it was with the first. Keep in mind, Isaiah is speaking to his people who have been captured again by the Assyrians. And Assyria's demise is foretold in this. And Isaiah opens chapter 11 with some of probably the sweetest, most soothing, comforting words of hope that these crushed and struggling Judeans could have ever hoped to hear as they anguished in exile. The revitalization of this stump of Jesse. Jesse was David's father, and so it's really referring to Jesus' lineage with the house of David. And here, this tree that they thought was long gone and dead and buried, suddenly there is the hope, the resurrection, the miracle of a sprout coming from that stump, that it will live again. As one Bible commentator puts it, Assyria would fall just as surely as some massive forest giant tree whose apparent strength is betrayed by a rotten heart. Out of the deep, thick humus of human faith and suffering, the tender, new growth of Jesse's lineage will shoot forth. Isaiah makes it clear that both of these activities, the felling of the original tree, the proud tree, and the nurturing of the small and fragile new one, is all a part of God's intentional plan in his work on our behalf. So our chapter then, verses 1 through 10, go on to depict this miraculously peaceful moment in this world because of the kind of rule that the restored Israel will enjoy under the leadership of what will become known as the child king. Isaiah first references that way back in the 9th chapter, the 6th verse. And instead, in this new configuration, this new world order, instead of relying on brute strength and force, as Assyria did, this rule will be imposed by this new shoot of Jesse and marked by wisdom and understanding and counsel and knowledge and fear of the Lord. And not a fear in terms of afraid, but a fear of respect and awe for God himself. All of these traits will be practiced by this new young ruler who will incarnate or manifest the prophets and the Lord's desire to establish true justice. A couple of months ago, as we talked about grace, and we talked about justifying grace, and this righteousness, a godly righteousness, being right with God. Verses 3 through 4 declare that wealth and influence will no longer determine the course of justice. You can't buy justice. Instead, the poor will be dealt with on an equal basis with the rich and the powerful. Revolutionary ideas to the ancients. And in this redeemed time, Isaiah declares that the righteousness, the Hebrew word here is mishpat, will determine the course of judgment and nothing else. The powerless will no longer need to fear the powerful, for all will find equal justice in the hands of this ruler to come. And the prophet then even goes on enforcing these righteous judgments, that these aren't going to require some strong army or these fear-inspiring weaponry or even these skilled strategists seeking to win the battle. It will only take a word of judgment to enforce this divine mishpat, this righteousness, being right with God. Thinking again of that story of Adam and Eve and the creation in Genesis, it comes from simply God speaking it, and it is realized. Our salvation and justice will be equally by God's word alone. I'm sure that the ancients knew of rulers who would talk about their promise to do justice and to practice righteousness, but oftentimes their words turned out to be simply campaign promises to get them into power. And yet in verse 5, Isaiah contrasts that kind of shallowness to the attitude of this messianic ruler, that his commitment to righteousness will be a part of He'll wear it. It'll be part of his everyday attire, it says. He will wear his righteousness daily, displayed plainly as a belt around the waist. And after all of this, as if the reader has not yet grasped entirely this new rule, this new world order, Isaiah takes verses 6 through 9 to reveal just how wonderfully changed this whole of creation will be when this leader comes to his throne. All those that are locked in this predatory-prey relationship, and Isaiah speaks of it in terms of animals, but it can also be in terms of humanity, where one must die so that the other might live. All will be freed from that vicious cycle. Whether or not the lions lay with the lambs, the idea here is that there's a radical change in the world order and in our human existence as we have known it. And will occur when the Messiah, this second Adam, finally comes. Like all those animals that Isaiah names, the very essence of human nature will be altered by the Messiah's arrival. And verse 9, in fact, demonstrates how blessed this change will truly be when it declares, "They will not hurt or destroy." Hardly the human behavior that we hear in the headlines or see on news programs today. But this verse also testifies that because humans will have a personal, individual, intimate knowledge of God's righteousness, that as a result of all of that, peace will spread out all over the earth like, he says, the waters cover the sea. It'll saturate every aspect of our life and of our world. And the final verse in our morning's text introduces Isaiah's second message of chapter 11. The Messiah will be a signal flag, a bugle call, not only calling home the remnant of Israel, but for the first time calling all nations. It won't be just about a specific small group or tribe. It will include all of humanity to an equally divine sense of justice. Back in the 18th century, the 1700s, there was a folk hymn written anonymously that was entitled "Christ the Apple Tree." It's a great Advent anthem as we begin this season of preparation, remembering the first Advent and arrival of the Messiah, and for his promise to come again. Part of that hymn goes, "The tree of life my soul hath seen, laden with fruit and always green. The trees of nature fruitless be, compared with Christ, the apple tree. His beauty doth all things excel. By faith I know, but ne'er can tell, the glory which I now can see in Jesus Christ, the apple tree. For happiness I long have sought, and pleasure dearly I have bought. I missed of all, but now I see, 'tis found in Christ the apple tree. I'm weary with my former toil. Here I will sit and rest a while. Under the shadow I will be of Jesus Christ, the apple tree. The fruit doth make my soul to thrive. It keeps my dying faith alive, which makes my soul in haste to be with Jesus Christ, the apple tree." That tree of life, that tender new shoot out of the stump of Jesse, came to its fullest expression in a wondrous and yet terrible way. In fact, it came on a tree of death. The life of the second Adam, Jesus the Christ, came to full fruition on a different tree, of which crosses were oftentimes referred to. So we celebrate the birth of Christ by decorating with apples of life and all other kinds of glitter, even while we remember that it will also be a tree that will serve to crucify him. There's an old legend about Zacchaeus, that short little tax collector who wanted to see Jesus so badly, and he climbed up into the limbs of a sycamore tree to see him. The legend suggests that in Zacchaeus' later years that he rose early every morning and left the house. His wife became curious and decided one morning to follow him, and followed him to the town well, where he picked up a bucket and filled it full of water. and then walked until he came to a sycamore tree. There, setting down the bucket, he swept away the debris and clutter that had accumulated at the foot of the trees, and then he poured water on the roots. And he stood silently and gently caressing the trunk with his hands. Confused and perplexed, his wife comes out of hiding and says, "What in the world are you doing?" To which Zacchaeus replied simply, "This is where I found Christ." The Germans have a hymn, O Tannenbaum, O Christmas Tree. Hitler loved that song because nowhere in it does it mention Christ. And the goal was to secularize Christmas as much as they could. But they also have another hymn. It's entitled The Fairest Tree, a part of which says, "O let him in, 'tis not a dream. Your heart shall be his garden, wherein shall grow a tree most fair, protected by his care, and yielding peace and pardon." And yielding peace and pardon. Peace and pardon. Any symbol can become an idol when it becomes the focus of our attention instead of reminding us of a greater truth. Your bulletin cover this morning is a pictorial of the message this morning. It's from a Christmas card that I received years ago and just really appreciated. It really tells the story. And the challenge for us is at the start of this Advent season is to let God's truth shine. Not only through your Christmas tree, not only through your Christ tree, but perhaps even more importantly, to let it shine through your life. And not just through this Advent season, but through the rest of our lives. Amen. Please rise.